Thanks very much for coming. Thank you, Frontline, for organising this. What we're going to do, basically, is very informal. We'll have a bit of a chat, look at some pictures. Tim and I are going to have a bit more of a chat, and then if anyone has any questions, we'll have some questions and answers and have a bit more of a chat. So it's really just a lot of chat and some pictures. Tim is a colleague of mine, he's also a very good, close personal friend, and we've worked together in West Africa over the space of many years now. And Tim first started working as a photographer in West Africa in 1999 in Liberia, and has then travelled extensively throughout the region, through most of West Africa, in fact, at various crucial times in the political and social economic development of the key playing countries in the area. And you'll have seen Tim's work probably in Newsweek, the front cover of Time, The Independent, many years ago, even The Big Issue. And represented by network photographers, as he was for many years, his work has been published widely throughout the world. Tim's now an independent documentary photographer, photojournalist, and also artist. So, as I believe you once told me in a slightly inebriated moment. Anyway, there we go. Before we start, West Africa is not an obvious place to spend most of your working life. Having spent a bit of time there myself, I know how charming it can be at times. Perhaps you'd just like to give us a bit of a rundown on why West Africa, and a little bit of the history of you working there before we delve into some of the pictures.
Well, obviously it's not the food, but I suppose what was interesting was that the first trip I made was when somebody asked me to go to Liberia. And that was the first country I'd ever been to in West Africa, in Africa. And I had a very unique experience there, which was that I was walking down the main boulevard, Tubman Boulevard, and Charles Taylor, he'd been in South Africa. He said on a diplomatic mission, but it was really medical treatment. And he summoned all his ministers to the airport, and they drove back into town, and it was a convoy of about 100 vehicles, 4x4s, and in the middle were three stretched Mercedes limousines with tinted glass, and troop convoys in between, with 4x4s with mounted technicals with machine guns, and kind of very strange-looking people, holding on the sides of the cars. And around me was the blown-up buildings from the war, and there was a woman next to me. You all had to stop where you were walking, and there's no way to take a picture of it. I mean, it's totally forbidden. And there was a woman next to me jumping up and down, shouting, "Taylor is our Lord, Taylor is our Lord." And it was such a bizarre experience because it was my first time in Africa, and that experience, I suppose, when I looked around me, and I just thought, how can this place exist on the same planet that I've inhabited up to that point? And I think that was a sort of opening for me of my interest in West Africa and in Liberia. And it sort of developed, and it's kind of funny, we'll show some of the Liberia work, but we wanted tonight also to have a sort of discussion about Liberia, about West Africa and the politics as much as about the photography. But what is interesting with the Taylor thing was that my relationship with Liberia has continued through the work that we did together in the war, and then subsequently living there, and now working for the UN just recently, not as a photographer. And out of there also came then sort of wider looking at other countries, because once I understood what was going on in Liberia, or thought I understood what was going on in Liberia, then I became interested in what's the connection to Sierra Leone, and then what's the connection to Ivory Coast, and then ultimately all roads lead to Nigeria. So it opened up in that way. And I think then West Africa as an area has an incredible history. I mean, firstly, there's a number of fault lines we build tonight as this fault line of West Africa, and I think that there's a number of key fault lines around the world. Obviously the one that's most presented in the media is the Middle East, but West Africa is another fault line, and it has an amazing history. I mean, in terms of from, well, we're talking about slave, I mean, now on the radio this morning, this sort of slave reparation discussion going on. It's an incredibly rich area. And it's the area that is probably the most, I mean, apart from, say, Congo, it's an incredibly vibrant part of Africa. Frisky, the Sierra Leoneans would say about it. And, you know, and it has it's had significant developments since in post-colonial history. So all of those issues, I think, are what kept me, I mean, I've worked all over Africa, but West Africa has that hold on me.
Frisky clearly covers a multitude of sins. Just to be clear, you've worked in Liberia from before the war, right through the civil war between the Lord forces and the government, and then through the peace negotiations, through the elections, into what's now the elected government of Liberia. You've worked in the Ivory Coast during the civil war there, in Sierra Leone at the end of the civil war there, through into the international presence, in Nigeria, specifically in the Delta, as well as in Lagos. And really, I think we can say that, you know, the breadth of coverage as a photographer, whether you're a photojournalist or a documentary photographer or an artist, which is open to further discussion, there aren't many people working visually who've covered the ground, the breadth and the depth that you have. So let's have a look at some of these pictures. We're going to start off with around 50 pictures, which is a journey through Tim's Liberia work from the war.
Yeah, this work is a condensed form. I'm trying to put together a book at the moment, and this is a sort of just a small edit of some of the work that goes through those periods.
I'm just going to get my head out the way while we do this.
Hold on a second. Let me get rid of that bar up there. There we go. Sorry a second. Start that again.
we'll return to some of those images a bit later. I noticed that one thing that seems to define you as a photographer, as an image maker, is that you're incredibly reluctant to talk about the actual process of taking the photographs themselves. And the photographs are shown with no commentary and no caption. And it's always been, in my experience of working with you, that you're much more interested in talking about the themes that surround the images and the context in which they're taken, rather than the actual images themselves. Why is that?
There's part of me that really likes photography, that likes the aesthetics. You know, the images are, very aesthetic in a certain way, and I like that process. But there's part of me that doesn't really care about photography. Photography is a vehicle to explore something, and when photography stops being useful, then I'll stop being a photographer. I'm not a sort of person that ever claimed to have picked up a camera when I was 12 years old. My father gave it to me. I don't care about it in that way. But I think that image making brings a layer of information to a subject that is, we live in a visual world. It's a dominant medium. And I think that like they're using medium format stuff, and it brings a color and a texture. I mean, it was interesting in when I first started work, I worked in black and white. And there's a lot of discussion in photography between use of color, use of black and white. And I think black and white is a great medium. But for me, I started working in black and white, and then I decided after a while that it wasn't appropriate for this sort of work. That there was something, that it seemed that especially with regards to certain subjects in Africa, that we have abstracted them to a point where we are no longer providing really important information. And everybody thinks, or the suggestions are, in the world of the NGO type world, constructed world, leads us to believe that Africa, the solution for Africa is in money, but it's not. The solution for Africa is in representation and that sort of how we see it, how we take part in it. And so the images, image making and photography is important to me, because in this case with these images, I think that a textural approach, the colors, those sort of things are as important, or are part of the story, to make Liberia seem like a more three-dimensional place than I saw in a lot of, and I was making myself in black and white photography. And so in some ways what I'm saying is that photography, it is really important to me. But in other ways, I think that there are a lot of photographers, or there is a lot of images around the world, and coming up on the escalators in Paddington tonight with those crazy screens, it's like we're bombarded by decontextualized images the whole time. And I think that contextualizing images and the themes are really important. And it's,
Well, looking at the themes of the photographs that these photographs were taken, looking at the context that these photographs were taken in, I mean, it's pretty confusing, basically. I mean, not the images themselves, but the political situation that gave rise to the fact that you wanted to be there in the first place to document it. I've worked there fairly intensively for the last sort of 5 years or so, and if I step out of it for a couple of months, I feel like I haven't been there for a couple of years. Things move so quickly. Things are so interconnected that it seems that pulling one little thread, whole sections of your understanding unravel. And, some of the big things that stick in people's minds with West Africa are going to be conflicts over resources, diamonds. People will think, well, yes, the RUF cut people's arms off, or someone cut someone's arms off in Sierra Leone, and there was a war, and there was a man called Charles Taylor. Perhaps, maybe people might know that he's on trial. Liberia always sounds like a pretty bad place, and someone somewhere, once said that they ate each other. I mean, it doesn't really, general public understanding doesn't really seem to go very far beyond that at times. Perhaps now with the bicentenary of slavery, we've been bombarded with images and audio and video of slave forts on the West African coast, of the role of Europeans and Africans themselves in the slave trade, and that's perhaps refocused attention briefly on West Africa. But what are the themes that drive conflict? What's making this happen? Because West Africa, for as long as I've been covering it, is terribly unpleasant, extremely violent, and deeply difficult to understand. So in the time that you've been there, what are you taking out of it? what drives what we're seeing here?
Well, I mean, you put yourself in a situation to find those things. I mean, I know that there's some people in the audience from Nigeria or from West Africa who for West Africa is a very pleasurable place to be. But anyway, I think that I mean, one of the main things about it, and I suppose a lot of the work I'm interested in is, you know, I was interested in the Liberia work about power. And you know, and a lot of you hear a lot of photographers always saying that this, you know, that they're interested in the victims, or this is what it's about, and you know, the people in the hospitals. And for me, I was never, you know, I'm interested in where the power lay in Liberia and how it was transformed. I mean, you know, Liberia is a unique place in so many different ways, and I mean, the history, it's history. It's larger than life. I mean, what other countries can say over the last 4 presidents in Liberia? You know, Tolbert was bayoneted to death in his bed when by an opportunist coup. Then Samuel Doe was was cut up, his ears cut off, his balls cut off, and died in a bathtub, and it was all filmed. That film tape still circulates in Monrovia. Then Charles Taylor perfected the inversion of a society. I mean, you know, the word failed state was coined for Liberia. Taylor was an absolutely incredible. He turned, you know, Liberia became a criminal state, and he's now facing war crimes in The Hague. And then, you know, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is the first female president in Africa, and this is from a country of 3.5 million people. And you can go back in the history in Liberia and find just incredible things that happened. I mean, you know, about power, you know, there was, I mean, the things that link, say, Congo and Liberia. I mean, you mentioned cannibalism. Is the fact of the rainforest. I mean, there is, you know, a primary rainforest is where very strong traditional beliefs occur. And so no wonder that cannibalism and ritual sacrifice are apparent in Congo and in Liberia. And then when the settlers came to Liberia, they started their own system because they realized that this is about power. It's about controlling and solidifying a society together for respect for elders, for respect for the rainforest. And you know, and so the Masons, these freed slaves, and remember, Liberia was colonized by blacks. It wasn't a system of white colonial activity, although it was kind of, because the whites, a lot of the children, the mixed race children in America were sent back by whites. But it has a very unique position. I mean, the other people say that only Liberia and Ethiopia were not colonized. Liberia was kind of colonized, but in a very strange way. And so when they arrived, then the Masons started up, and there's a big Masonic temple and fraternity in Liberia. And the Masons realized that they were kind of scared by this ritual sacrifice, this power that the local indigenous population in the hinterland had. And so they started ritual sacrifice. There's a system called Hand for Blood, and there's a place in southeastern Liberia called Harper, and there's about 6 big Masonic temples, and they used to practice ritual sacrifice there until the 70s, and eventually got stopped because when Tolbert, the president, realized that unless he did something, that Harper and Maryland, that county, was going to go into open revolt, and so he prosecuted his fellow Americo-Liberians. And when Doe came to power, who was a guy from the interior, he killed nearly all the Grand Masters in the Masonic Temple. So it's very much about power. And so my looking at Liberia, I was interested by this way the power is transformed. And so, again, Liberia uniquely, how many countries can you say go from a full-blown civil war to a totally corrupt, transitional government to, a democratic process in what, 3 years? That's an incredible sort of acceleration to put through a country. And Liberia has become a laboratory for the international community. I mean, there is, unlike Sierra Leone that has squandered the peace process, Cabo has squandered it. Liberia has the goodwill of the international community, and it has become this laboratory. I mean, there's enough sort of legal students and UN people now out there to sort of, write papers till kingdom come. So it's an interesting process, what's happening.
Now, I take what you're saying about being interested in power, the inversion of power, the subversion of power, the uses and abuses of power. But what does that actually translate to in terms of image making? I mean, how is it that Liberia has descended into this maelstrom where countries like Senegal, for example, Ghana, Gambia, haven't? there's something very specific about Liberia that has caused this, and if you subscribe to a sort of regional domino theory, has infected other countries and also plunged them into a civil war. Why is that happening? What is it that's caused this to happen that makes you want to go there and take pictures?
I think Liberia is the eye of the storm, as it were, of West Africa in many ways. And I mean, trying to think of the causes why it became the eye of the storm, why it infected into Cote d'Ivoire, why it infected into Sierra Leone, why it's, I mean, pulled Nigeria in a way politically, and Nigeria is so involved in Liberia. And one can analyze that in a number of different ways, but to jump forward a stage and sort of say one of the big things about it is this idea of regional warriors, is young men, young, disaffected, economically disadvantaged men, you know, who sit around and I think with the acceleration of technology realize that there is a world out there that they're missing out on, and they want money. And that this idea of regional warriors, of fighters who have had years of experience of war, who have had no education. I mean, think the small boys unit, again, Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor perfected the use of child soldiers. I mean, now child soldiers is a very popular term, and people want to come and go and print stories about child soldiers. But Charles Taylor, when he started his invasion with the NPFL, the National Patriotic Front for Liberia, he realized that there were lots of young children whose parents had been killed. So he gathered them up and he armed them. I mean, I remember there's an interview where he's quoted as saying, you know, I armed them as a way of keeping them out of trouble. And then he fed them hard drugs. They were doing, you know, I mean, the Nigerians were complicit in bringing hard drugs into Liberia, you know, as part of ECOMOG, the peacekeeping force that was there. I mean, don't forget, Nigeria was funding, you know, was arming a faction in the 90s called the LPC, the Liberian Peace Council. So they're very much involved in this status quo of war, of exploiting the war. And Taylor had this unit called the SBU, Small Boys Unit, and they were, you know, they were his bodyguards. And so these guys grew up from the ages of 8 or so. I mean, I remember being with you with Abraham, who was a very able frontline fighter. And they grew up not being educated. And what do they do 10 years later? What do they know? They know how to fight. And the recent crisis in Guinea is a point in case. I mean, you know, Liberian ex-combatants were being shipped into Guinea to try and prop up, in case it happened, the regime of Conte. And, you know, so those fighters as well will move. And because of the tribal system in, you know, in West Africa, then people are, you know, on the border. If you're born in northern Liberia, you know, you can have a Guinean identity card in one hand and a Liberian identity card in the other because of your birthright. And so you will move. And the same is in Ivory Coast. When Taylor decided to destabilize Ivory Coast, you know, it's very easy to do that because you have this huge mass of young men, thousands of them, who get off on fighting because they know they can loot and they can rape, and it's a problem.
I wonder how we got to that position in the first place. I mean, I remember back at university I studied pre-colonial African history, and I was given a map of West Africa from about the time of the beginning of the West African Jihad, so about 1780. And the only feature I recognised of the map was the coastline. Everything else was completely alien to me. I knew that I should recognise what I was looking at, but it looked like I was looking at a series of fried eggs imposed over other fried eggs. And the names of the tribes and tribal groupings and ethnic groupings I recognised, but where they were in relationship to anything that I recognised as a modern state was completely alien to me. And then superimposing a modern political map over that, and having looked at that again after working in West Africa, some things become, at least superficially, very clear. To what extent is this abuse of power, is this militarization of a whole generation of young men to do with a kind of, in a sense, a lack of belonging to a state enterprise and a sense of affiliation with a wider cultural, ethnic, tribal enterprise?
No, I mean, it's that. It's that, and it's, you know, it's the tribe. It's how when in West Africa, it's when does the state gain a strong enough identity to override tribal impulses, and yet people like Taylor would come along and force certain would fine. Those are very tribal lines, are very easy lines to open up and to tear down the country on. And it's interesting that, that if you look at Ivory Coast, I mean, the Gere tribe in the western Ivory Coast, where most of the fighting is going on, was going on during the Civil War, they're very hard, and the Liberian mercenaries were involved over that side. The Gere are the same people as the Kran in Liberia. It's the same, or the Mandingos in Liberia, northern Liberia, the same as the Malinke in southern Guinea. So, these groups are the same, and they speak the same language, and they have a stronger identity of themselves than they do for their own countries. And, I don't know, when that's definitely one of the reasons why Liberia exists as a fault line, I think.
It's sort of like a severance line.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is the inability of the international community to really dissect get into West Africa is also is the problem by how they approach the problem, how they approach West Africa. I mean, if you look at, currently there's 2 UN missions. I mean, most of the UN missions around the world are in Africa. One in Liberia, one in Ivory Coast, and the missions are not joint; they're separate missions. And you have military observers in the UN who do 6 months. So you're on a 6-month rotation. You turn up on the borderland with Ivory Coast in Liberia, and then you leave. And it's like there's no ability to really comprehend the complexity of the problem there. And then everybody can sort of then say, well, this is an insolvable problem. And it's not really. It's just the way we approach it. The international community has been approaching it.
Well, I have a very sort of first-hand personal experience of that very recently, of returning from a trip to Ivory Coast and meeting members of a Gere militia in southern Ivory Coast, who are armed to the teeth and rather bellicose, despite the ongoing peace negotiations, who are the same tribal grouping as the Model former rebel group in Liberia, who are Krans, and it's the same tribal, ethnic, cultural grouping. It's very interesting to see that in Liberia, that group has been apparently disarmed and brought into the political process, and in Ivory Coast that group remains armed and outside of the political process, and that it became very clear, talking to commanders on the ground, that they see no distinction whatsoever in their command and control military and political structures between the Ivorian side of the border and the Liberian side of the border. And it seems a bit like sort of watching, I don't know, Wandsworth Council and Southwark Council trying to sort out a gang problem and saying, well, we're not going to do anything about that end of the street because that's another borough, so we're just going to forget that. And it seemed incredible to me that here I was surrounded by people heavily armed, actively engaged in acts of violence, and clearly everything was not okay.
I mean, it's also it's also the trend. You're talking about the deeper implications of how this came about, and I think that the West and the mineral exploitation in West Africa, also sets a trend for this to continue to happen. People don't see, there is no long-term investment. I mean, even Mittal Steel, who's come into Liberia, it's still the same basis of we need to get in and get out. There is no sense of the West or international community ever coming to West Africa except to take and run. And I don't see any changes now. Whatever we talk about the new Liberia, I don't see any. If you look at the contracts and the commissions, it's on that same basis. And so no wonder tribes still think of themselves like, let's get in there, let's get all the gold or whatever out, and let's run and look after our own people. So I think that came about from years of historical impulse of developing that way of approaching the region.
Well, we both know this subject very well. We've been talking about it for 30 minutes. I'm completely confused. So let's have a look at some pictures again. Let's go back to some of the pictures we've looked at, because somehow out of this kind of niçoise of political intrigue, as we're live streaming on the internet, by the way, I'm not allowed to swear this evening, so there we are. I'm very interested, by the way, in how you make sense of this visually. And now I'm going to force you to talk about some of these pictures, even if you don't really want to. And you can't lie about some of them, because I was standing next to you when you took them. So there we go. Now, well, let's go up to the top. Yeah, there we go. Now, making sense of it. Second picture, which is labelled number 3, there we are. what is going on there? What's this about?
These guys are the. This was the group called the Liberia, and was a complex civil war, different groups, and this group was the LURD, the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy. They have there's such great acronyms over there. And these guys were setting off on the road from Tubmanburg, which is the rebel-held town, to Monrovia, and was made actually when I was making a film with James. I always regretted I never got hold of one of the T-shirts. But yeah, so they walked 50 kilometers, and I suppose get back to photography again. The thing about it is, you want to say, is about this picture really. This is the only picture that exists, the mortaring of Monrovia, and so it's about, photography as a witness has that great capacity. There's only one frame of it, and it was funny because afterwards there was a lot of discussion about, did the rebels mortar Monrovia at first, or was it the government mortaring it, etc., etc. But the fact that this, to have this piece of evidence, this was, was the LURD mortaring the capital. Well, because I live with them. Oh, but how do you know? He's got the brown. I've manipulated and put the brown T-shirt on him.
And that palm tree there on the third one from the left is well known.
Yeah, exactly.
To Liberian watchers. We'll come back to this photograph because there's a lot going on here that has other sort of themes attached to it. I wondered, if we're looking here at F12. With that, there we are, up a bit, there we are, fantastic. Now this, I remember, was a particularly bad day because both of us survived this day as a statistical aberration, not through any dint of our own ability, I think, by the end of it. And you're also very reluctant, I noticed, to talk about the kind of equipment that you use and the sort of all the techie stuff that I love getting my teeth into. It's worth saying at this point that Tim shoots on many of his photographs on a 1930s Rolleiflex. And if any of you are familiar with 1930s Rolleiflex, it's very difficult to load, under sort of duress. And it's a sort of top-down inverted image medium format camera. And I mention this because sitting next to Tim in a traffic jam, being strafed with automatic gunfire at about 50 yards, losing a lot of window glass, trying desperately to crawl out the back window. Tim was there changing film, casually handing me back shot rolls of roll film, saying, "Could you just stick that down for me, please?" While another couple of AK rounds cracked through the side of the car. And apart from the utter insanity of attempting to do that when you don't have to because you have nice shiny digital cameras that do it all very quickly for you, you're choosing to shoot on what some would say was, an interesting, if not inappropriate, medium. Why do you do it?
During this part of the war, it was interesting because in Monrovia we lived with James and I were the only people to live with the rebels during the war, and so you had a lot of photographers in Monrovia covering the Taylor forces defending this lot, and everybody's shooting digital, and the look was very different. I like the fact that medium format. I just like the dynamic, the aesthetic dynamic of a 6.6 image, and also it made more sense in terms of that what you were producing was just so visually different to a lot of stuff that was out there, and that then stands in good stead. Not many people do this, and therefore it means your work is different from a lot of the wire stuff out there. Increasingly the wire photographers they're great shooters, and so they wouldn't they have to shoot digital form, and I think that's one of the reasons is in order to sort of differentiate yourself. And secondly is working in that sort of way, you have to slow yourself down. And when your approach slows down, I don't know, something happens to your relationship to the subject. And I like the fact that you bring a quieter atmosphere to something that's much, it's a more pensive attitude to the subject matter. Also, that shooting on negative film means that you have a flexibility where you can then use them in a variety of ways for exhibition stuff. I mean, there's a higher quality image. And I wanted, as I said, the idea of colors and textures were very important to me. It wasn't just about the action. And, you know, I find that there's a propensity for a lot of photojournalism to be creating a sort of fake emotion nowadays. It's sort of like the emotive side of photojournalism to create this sort of fake emotion. And you know, where I said that other layer information, color and stuff that's so important to the subject matter was being sort of forgotten, and I think that comes out in medium format.
If we just go back to the main selection, there's another photograph which is one of my personal favourites, which is top right, F8. You know, now, you know, photographs like this really annoy me because I was hosing this down with digital video, you know, and I don't have this picture. And I looked at Tim's pictures afterwards, and like, you know, I mean, you know, he's virtually, you know, kissing them goodbye himself. I mean, it's such an intimate portrait, and you know, what happened after this picture was taken was that, you know, most of these young guys didn't go home, and this, you know, it's a very poignant image. What I'm interested in, you're talking about use of medium format cameras, of getting close and intimate with your subject, which is evident. But there are limits attached to it as well.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things with the Liberia stuff is that, you know, people, it's very easy to come across and just sort of say that these guys are all killers, and their life is much more complex than that. And these guys are you know, husbands, lovers, wives, you know, mothers in some case. And you know, and I think that what I wanted to do in the Liberia work was bring this sort of, you know, something more sort of familiar and domestic or sensitive, maybe in that sort of way, to a situation. And you know, I know that Liberia is sort of, you know, if you say, well, what do you know? What's the image that conjures up in Liberia? Or say, you know, it will be some sort of atrocity. And I thought it was very interesting. There was an exhibition a couple of years ago when I showed work at Perpignan, and there was another guy showing work at Perpignan, a very famous French war photographer, and you know, people go and see this stuff, and he had, like, you know, all the sort of gruesome headless bodies, and you know, and you know, all the sort of gore you could possibly have, and you know, and I remember everybody coming out of that exhibition talking about the photographer, and I just thought it was so tragic that in the end, this is what it's become. It's like, you know, that we go there and we sort of are obsessed by sort of war photographers and how hard it, you know, that sort of stuff, and really, and I like the way that I like my work to work in opposition to that, to have a sort of softness to it, and to challenge you and make you think of the complexities of people. You know, and as well, and not to become like, you know, again, going back to black and white work in Sierra Leone. I mean, I remember working in Sierra Leone at the beginning, working in black and white, and in the end, it's like you were making images like everybody else of just like, what does Sierra Leone conjure in your head? Okay, it's people who had their hands chopped off. You know, do we actually know who those people are? Do the images take us any closer to those people? I don't think so. A lot of the time, they're abstracted and depersonalized. And so I wanted to create a body of work that had a sort of personalization to it, and that in the end, and maybe we can go after this and show some of the other images of, you know, of who are these people. This idea of historical accuracy, of naming names, of demystifying this sort of like, oh, this is all blood and guts in Liberia and everybody's killing each other. It's like, no, what was the process? Who was involved? What happened? And, you know, those things for me are really crucial.
If we just go back to the mortar picture briefly. I suppose one of the sort of recurrent themes of working in a war zone. This is, you know, an active live war zone. As you say, this is the only still image of the mortar bombardment of Monrovia. As well as recording what's going on, as well as showing the, you know, the personalities and the preferences of the people involved, you're also bearing witness to something. Right? And this is evidence. Yeah. This is not merely a photograph. This is something which can be used dynamically to affect the future of people's lives by cropping up in a court case or in further investigation. Are you aware of that when you're working? Is that informing the way you work in this situation?
I don't know. I mean, there's a sort of limit sometimes. I sometimes think there's a limit to photographic evidence and how far a photograph can be evidence. You know, I don't think it's interesting now working as an investigator. You know that I don't take pictures really. You know, it's there's a process of proof that sometimes don't have with photography. You know, I have more the sense when I'm working as a photographer, you know, as a sense of history. I'm very much aware of history, and I want that to inform my work. And so, and therefore history is evidence? Yes, I suppose so. And I think there is an importance, as we'll see with the next set of work, about this sort of, you know, the accountability and you know, capturing people, as it were, you know, to hold them responsible.
I know that you're now working on the UN panel of experts on, especially looking at the use of mercenaries in conflict in West Africa, in the Liberian context, and doubtless that will result in a report of some description, and that report will be published somewhere. And you know, I'll read it because I like you, and I'll probably be researching a film, and a couple of other people here are actually paid to read those reports, and that's probably, you know, about the extent of it. And if it's really sensational, maybe a line will make it into a newspaper somewhere, but probably not, which is nice.
You're too kind.
I haven't started yet. And but this tells me everything I need to know about that particular episode, really. I mean, the Human Rights Watch reports were fantastic. You know, they were really great, and you know, they were a very valid and you know, professionally valuable tool in the field. And both of us should know that, as we contributed work to it. But in the end, if you're going to disseminate evidence, if you're going to disseminate information which is beyond design and is beyond an anecdote, how are you best going to do that? What's the limit of the photograph? What's the limit of the written report? Where do you take your work from here?
No, I think it's an interesting point, because I was talking to there was one human rights organization that approached me, you know, not long ago, and said, we're trying to do a report about, you know, it was someone like Afghanistan, and they were saying, you know, that we realize that our report doesn't have any effect anymore, and that, you know, they instead are thinking of like a visual approach to making a report. And that's kind of interesting now. And if you look at the communications departments of these sort of organizations, they're growing, they're gaining more power, and as people come to realize that, you know, that the visual approach is more sought after. So yeah, I mean, it's
when something like this happens, there's, you know, apart from the person who, you know, puts the bomb in the tube or pulls the trigger, there's usually someone behind it and someone behind them. And sometimes, you know, the person who's ultimately behind the act can be a very long way behind the act. And the discussions and the conversations that take place for that act to occur can be incredibly off the cuff. I was sitting in a restaurant with a couple of, with a friend and, you know, an acquaintance once, who came up with the fantastic idea of overthrowing the government of Equatorial Guinea. And, you know, almost. Someone is responsible for this. Someone's responsible for the burned buildings in Monrovia. Someone's responsible for the however many 100,000 people were killed, depending on which figures you look at. We very, very rarely hear their names. We almost never see their faces. So maybe you could go on to the next set of photographs.
Yeah. What's interesting is in the work is here you've seen a sort of it's a lot of different types, you know, of work carried over my time there. But I also get interested in series of work, and so this was something I'm doing. I'm just going to show you two types of series that I do whilst I was working in Liberia. This is what I call my rogues gallery. Where is he? This is Prince Johnson. We'll go through them quickly. Joe Barler. Actually, can I get them to stop? Escape them. Maybe I should do it like this. I'll put it on one at a time.
So now you want to talk about them?
Yeah. This is Prince Johnson. He was head of the IMPFL, the Independent National Patriotic Front for Liberia. He met Charles Taylor first met Taylor in Libya at a training camp after Taylor had escaped from prison in the States and made his way to Ghana and then on to Libya. under Colonel Gaddafi's re-education program. And Prince was later then became famed because he was the guy that ordered the extrajudicial killing of President Doe and filmed it. And he's now a senator. There are a number of very interesting senators in the Liberian parliament. Jewel Howard Taylor, ex-wife of Charles Taylor, is a senator. General Peanut Butter, known as Adolphus Dollo, is a senator of Nimba County. God, who else is there? There's another. Sar Bolly, who is the head of SOD, Special Operations Division, a known killer, is House of Representatives. So there's a whole bunch of people in there hanging out in the Liberian Parliament. And I go and interview them, and then at the end, because you can't really go off and ask these guys to do a photo shoot, so you say, listen, I'm an historian, and you interview them, and then at the end I pull out a camera, and I just use the direct flash method. I thought, I'm not going to make an aesthetic picture out of these people, because, so it's just a flash camera. It's a kind of ugly technique, but I think it works. This is Joe Barler. Joe Barler was in Ulimo J. Ulimo J was a faction in the 90s. He then moved into the LERD. And then this is him under the corrupt transitional government. He was the head of the Port Authority. Interestingly enough, when Joe got chased out of town in '98 by Taylor when there was an abortive coup attempt on Taylor by the Ulimo, and Taylor basically arrested a whole load of them and killed a whole load of them. Joe escaped to Nigeria, where he obviously made some very good friends there. And then under his tenure as the president of the Port Authority, the Liberia became known as a very good source of drugs transshipment to the West. Then this is Aisha Kone. Aisha is a spiritual advisor to Lansana Conte of Guinea. Aisha was the link person between getting the funding and the weapons, I suppose, from Lansana Conte of Guinea to the LERD. The LERD were primarily a Mandingo, a Muslim organization. Not Muslim, it's not the same as the sort of Islamic stuff going on there, but they have they're a Muslim tribe. And Aisha has also been implicated in this in the movement of ex-combatant Mandingos into Guinea during the recent crisis. She was also a supporter of the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's party, and that has caused a little confusion for everybody concerned recently.
Ellen included.
Yeah, Ellen included for sure. This is Bo Bajoy Boy. He was the chief of staff of MODEL, the Movement for Democracy in Liberia. And before that, he was a major player in the LPC, the Liberian Peace Council, who are known for their human rights abuses. And this is him at the Ministry of Finance, of course, in the transitional government. I mean, where else would you go after you're reaching the heavy heights of MODEL? So this is him during the NTGL. And this is Sia Sharif. This is the chief of staff of the LERD forces, who we live with for a couple of months, and he was deputy defence minister in the national transitional government, and now he is up to all sorts of different things. But he's kind of a good friend of mine, so yeah. So that's the road, and I continue to do that. That's the. Shall I show the graffiti stuff?
Let's come on to that in a minute.
Okay.
Just a little minute there. Let there be light. Oh, we can stay with some light for a moment. That's very nice. It's always strange when you kind of look at people implicated in mass murder with a sort of sentimental kind of oh, weren't they the days? Strange, really. And you have to. I mean, only Liberia, by the way, could come up with the Special Operations Directive for, a group of state-sponsored murderers. I mean, only in Liberia could they be called SOD. There we go. These people here who've agreed to have their photograph taken, why? Why do they do it?
I think it's vanity in the sense that if you go to them and you say to them, it's always that sense of history for them as well. People want to go down in history, but they also want to go down in history for the right reasons. They want a case to explain themselves. I mean, I remember being on assignment for the New Yorker with John Lee Anderson. We did a piece on Ellen, on Liberia, and we went to interview Prince Johnson. and he has every journalist coming into Liberia, painting him with such a tarnished brush. Fair enough. Okay, the guy was a pretty brutal fighter. But when John Lee interviewed him, he really came alive, and he said, listen, yeah, I killed all those people, and yes, I killed Doe. He said, but he was coming up to Nimba, my homeland, and he was killing all of my tribe. What was I supposed to do? Yes, there were excesses committed, but I was defending my tribe. And he said it with such compunction that I kind of, I came out of the interview saying that's pretty reasonable, But so he wants to rewrite history, and I think that it's important, especially with TRC, well, if it ever gets off the ground, but Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or with the looming threat of a war crimes tribunal, or with Taylor going down in The Hague, that people want to have a clean record. They want to rewrite their history. And so I suppose explaining themselves to journalists is one way of that they convince themselves that they're cleaning their slate.
Some of these people are, well, potentially going to end up standing trial at some point. It's theoretically possible. Taylor is currently standing trial. I was asked to testify against Taylor in The Hague, which I have so far declined to do. And though I did testify against the Dutch national who was implicated in smuggling and convicted, importantly, for smuggling.
Who's now off on day release.
Who's now off on day release, yeah.
He's gone to Paris, the Dutch Gus Kuenhoven.
There's an appeal going through.
Yeah. He's with his girlfriend in Paris now.
Bless them.
The Dutch are very liberal. They think it's really outrageous to keep somebody in prison who's been convicted for 8 years for weapons trafficking.
Anyway, thanks for that. That's made me feel warm and fuzzy. Anyway, should it arise that your work, your experience is called upon by a body to help prosecute the individuals that you met while working, would you do that?
That is a very difficult question that I
would like an answer to.
I haven't yet reached that point, and I'd have to make the decision when I got there. I don't know. At the moment as well, with the work I do now, it feels very close to that line between, knowing a lot of people out there and then also working in a way that, for me, it's about, I bring to the table a certain knowledge about the region and Liberia, and anything that can help solidify a lasting, durable security for Liberia. That's how I reason to myself what I do now. But there are times where it feels that you're treading a very thin line for, on that. Like Sia Sharif is somebody who will stop in the street and give me a lift and talk to me and will see me any time. Joe Bala is another, and yet, so it's kind of difficult. Not saying that those guys will be facing trial in the near future, but I'm just saying that there are relationships that make those things ultimately difficult, and so I don't know yet. I know that I've come to a point on that line where I am at the moment, and I feel it's just about tenable where I am. Whether I want to cross over that line, maybe, and if I did cross over the line, I don't think that it would be then, then I'd have to reevaluate my relationship about going to Liberia and being in Liberia again. At the moment, it's, a lot of the guys don't know what I don't, sanctions, one of the things about sanctions is they targeted the MPP, the National Patriotic Party in Liberia. So it's, and those people, Taylor put the death, we never had a good relationship with them during our work as a journalist, so that kind of is okay. It's a difficult thing, I'm not so sure.
Let's have a look at the graffiti pictures.
Yeah, these pictures I took over the course of 4 years. I'll show them and then we can talk a little bit about them.
I mean, these are very simple photographs. They're not elaborately constructed, and they're not particularly complicated visually. Why did you take them?
I took them. It was kind of interesting. When I was working in Sierra Leone during the civil war there, and at the tail end, 99, 2000, and I was in eastern Sierra Leone, and I was with a UN combat team going into RUF, Revolutionary United Front territory. And it was after that the 500 Indian troops were taken hostage temporarily by the RUF. And I was with this Indian team, so thank goodness it was a bit before. And we turned up in a village, and I remember walking through the village, and it was a village that had been hastily deserted, and the whole place was empty. Obviously, it's deserted. And some of the buildings had this very crazy kind of graffiti all over it, this war graffiti, very disturbing. And in the environment of being there with these troops, you know, where you feel like you really know you're in this enemy territory, and then to come across these demonic type paintings, and so I photographed that, and I was working in black and white then, and that was the end of that story. And then when I came to Liberia, when I started working in color, I was back in Liberia. During the war, we were coming across this, I was coming across these pictures, and it kind of, the connection was made to Sierra Leone. And so I started to document them, because I just thought that it was an interesting, I mean, at first it's just, okay, this is interesting, but slowly over the time of documenting them, you realize that they have this, they're incredibly important. And they're incredibly important for a number of reasons. I felt they're very important because they tell the story of the war themselves in a sort of very, how Liberia was or how parts of West Africa have become inverted. Taylor perfected a system of inversion in Liberia, where kids became killers, where women were, not cooking but carrying ammunition, where teachers, became killers, and so the graffiti, it sort of, for me, it has all of that loaded into it, and almost like, again, talking about the sort of back to Perpignan and looking at those war images of atrocities, that in the end you become numb to it, and seeing then again the one, say, a lot of the imagery, the graffiti imagery is very terribly sort of sexual. I mean, and you have to remember that it's very difficult to get figures on the amount of rape and sexual abuse, but it's estimated that there's some amnesty, and again, figures are questionable, but they estimate 75% of women were either raped or sexually abused of the population. And so let's just say then that's 60%, or let's say that's 50%. That's still horrific. And so the images, a lot of them are very sexual, and I think they have far more power for me in talking about the war than, say, the sort of some of the more gory images that were taken during the Civil War by press photographers. So that's one of the things about it. The other thing about it was that that the names of people became very important. Again, this sense of accountability. Again, this this wanting to hold accountable people and being able to trace where certain fighters were. I mean, being able to go up to Colahun in northern Lofa and find Diamond, Black Diamond, my friend, the fighter who, looked after me during the fight. We both know her, and find her name daubed around the place, and be able to trace where individual fighters went, and yeah, so those are the sort of reasons why I put it together. I think, yeah. And also, one thing. Look, there was one last thing, which was, and I put this one in because for this very reason, it was like a sort of cycle for me of. I went up to a house in northern Lofa in a town called Zordamai. It was very sort of David Lynch-esque territory, a Loma village, ritual sacrifice still carried out there. I was taken to a place of killing where it was a mountainside where they used to. One villager described to me how Loma men were led, roped by the neck in 1998, a year after the war had officially ended. So Taylor's in power as president. He wins the presidency in 97. You know, people saying, you know, you kill my ma, you kill my pa, so I will vote for you. He gained the presidency. In '98, the ethnic killing is going on, where 500 young men tied together by the neck, taken to the side in Zordamai, this town, over a cliff edge and shot and dumped over the edge of a precipice. And at the top, behind that precipice, in front of that precipice on the hill, was this house. And I went in this house last June, and I was passing it, and I just went in, and I found this very disturbing graffiti all over it. And what was interesting was that this picture, where it says "RUF, can you remember?" and this allusion to the Revolution United Front. This is Liberia, remember. This isn't Sierra Leone, where the Revolution United Front was fighting. And so I found this allusion, and then you had the villagers, some people telling me, yes, they could remember back in the early 90s when trucks of MPFL, National Patriotic Front for Liberia fighters, Taylor's fighters, were driving through northern Lofa and crossing into Sierra Leone to prosecute the war on behalf of Fode Sanko and the RUF. And that this is the type of the graffiti that was left from those days. And that sort of now Taylor stands trial. Remember, Taylor stands trial in The Hague, not for crimes committed in Liberia, but for crimes committed in Sierra Leone. And this regional warrior, the way that the wars have moved across boundaries, I found interesting that it was replicated in the graffiti, and took me back to the day of 2000 when I was in the village in Shibwema in eastern Sierra Leone in RUF-held territory. And so that was one of the reasons for me, again, that made sense of this to document this graffiti.
I must admit, for me, the graffiti was always a reminder of whenever I thought I was beginning to understand the people I was with and the situation I was in. The graffiti usually reminded me that I didn't, and it was often quite shocking. It kind of reminded that Bob Dylan lyric, "Something's happening here, but you don't know what it is." And it was like seeing the Adam and Eve graffito there that you photographed. It was like, okay, there is a mind much more complicated than the person I've just seen executing prisoners at work here. There are layers and textures to this which are not immediately prevalent in the fog of war.
And I think that one of the things why I like to work in, say, West Africa over such a period of time is because you eventually you transcend taking those images of, okay, let's go down to Crew Bay and shoot some some poor people in shacks, and let's go and shoot some guys with the guns, and you slowly work your way as a long-term documentary photographer in a region. You work your way through those images that are the sort of standard press fodder, and you start to find stuff for me that has a deeper, truer resonance. And that, you know, that although these pictures are very simple, I think that in terms of documentary, they have a depth of narrative that is crucial to discussing these issues, you know, which we'll see when it comes to the Nigeria stuff.
Yeah, before we can take some questions now. Before we do that, let's have a look at the last 10 pictures.
This stuff from Nigeria, and I just shot this last year from the Delta.
Now, I mean, there's some wonderful standalone images there. That second to last shot there of the rebels, that's very, very porny. Nice tight balaclava, lots of big shiny bullets. It's not hugely reminiscent of the other work you've shown us. I wonder where do we nice, you know, barrel going on there. What's the purpose of these pictures? Where do you go from here? Because there seems to be a real difference between these images and what you've shown us. This is very bright and colourful, but it seems quite superficial to me.
It's why I wanted to show it. I wanted to sort of show the fact that you begin, you know, you get an assignment. If you you support yourselves in a number of different ways. And so I have an assignment. I go to Nigeria, and we went to the beginning of the hostage-taking in February last year. And you make a story that visually you have the elements there for me that work, and the magazines or the person that's commissioned the story is very happy. But it just doesn't have that depth for me, that historical accuracy, or who is this person, what was going on, those sort of questions. And I suppose why I want to show this was, like, for me in the process of making pictures, that this is the first stage. This is like, now I'm very interested as my time in Liberia comes to an end, and I will find closure with it through the book. And then I want to, I'm more, all roads lead to Abuja, or all roads lead to the Delta, really, to Nigeria. And I suppose that now I'm asking myself, okay, this is the first step to working in Nigeria. You understand logistically how to get there, what's going on. But now, how do I create that depth that I've managed to create in Liberia in Nigeria? Like, who is going to be the Rose Gallery there? How am I going to explain the complex situation of the Delta? What techniques or what historical things will I need? And so, that for me, photojournalism or a lot of documentary photography can be, if it's just about this, just about showing great pictures with guys with guns and telling a story, it's something that I suppose I want to move on from. I want to do something different, and I think that's the sort of the path that I'm going down. To try and create a more complicated narratives to subjects, not just to sort of supply the magazine industry with the great stuff that they want to produce, or not as.
Right. Let's have some questions. We're just coming up to 9 o'clock. We were about 20 minutes late starting, so there we are. If you could give your name and your affiliation, that would be great, and fire away.
My name is Christian McLaughlin. I work for a West London local called the London Informer. I'm just curious, I suppose over time it changes the way you infiltrate these groups when you say we lived with these people for 2 months. I imagine at the beginning, I want to know how the process was in the beginning, and whether now when you say you're going to Nigeria, would it be a lot easier because of the context that you've made, or you're going to have to start again, meeting people, gaining trust, all that kind of stuff. Is it easy? Is it hard? How is it done?
I think it's what's interesting in doing long-term project work is that it is like you find, like, I feel like I find a blueprint. Not necessarily that the blueprint will change, but there are times over the 4 years in Liberia where I've taken longer over something because I didn't understand how to do it or what I was looking for. And I think that you develop a sensitivity for understanding what can guide you into the story or what's important, and an acuteness, a more acute way of looking or reading a situation or a story. And so I think that hopefully in Nigeria, which is a more complex, I think it's a very complex situation down there, but it will be slightly easier because of the work in Liberia. You understand? It's like, even once I'm not saying it's like once you've ridden a bicycle you never forget, but there is a sense I find in working that you develop that sort of experience to help you make a project. I hope it's quicker than Liberia because it's been quite a long slog over there.
Can we just bring up the photograph there of the double amputee in front of the red background?
Kind of.
To be honest, just because I'm so interested in it personally, I'm quite curious to the specifics of it. Is it just you met a character in the street and then things move on from there? Or do you go through your contacts with your organizations?
You go through your it's a contact thing, and it's also understanding. I mean, West Africa is all interrelated, and ultimately, the more you develop your contacts and your relationships, the more you understand the complexity of the situation, and the more you understand the agenda that a certain individual has, and what they're going to give you or what they're not going to give you. And so you can then understand how to access. If I sort of say, well, I want to go down the Delta, then you kind of understand, like, okay, what do I need to get down there? Who do I need to meet? And you also very much, and that's the difficulty that's why you want to live out there or be out in a story, because then you can understand, for any story, then you can understand, like, that everybody has an agenda. And so you understand how to navigate yourself through that agenda. The problem with a lot of foreign journalists is coming. I mean, the great story recently, and it was the Firestone story. Firestone, American company, rubber in Liberia, and this year, 200 years of anniversary abolition of slavery. So everybody wants to do a slavery story. Now, most people have, the journalists coming to Liberia know nothing about Liberia, and they come there and they're suddenly like, okay, great, tick the box, Firestone, modern corporate tyranny giant, modern day slavery. These people, rubber tappers, being paid $2 a day. That's outrageous. Okay, fine. So we're going to do a modern day slavery story. We can sell that to the picture editors. That's no problem, and they can run it. The truth is if you go down there, it's like earning $2 a day in Liberia is pretty darn good. I mean, if you don't understand the context, then you're producing journalism or that's really kind of slightly out of kilter with the reality of the situation. And so, that experience enables you to weave around and find the right people, find the right stories, I think.
Just to put that in context as well, if we can put up that picture of the double amputee in front of the red background, having said that we're not obsessed with amputees, here's one. One thing that Tim did when he was working at Monrovia was to set himself up as a street photographer. You'll see this quite a lot in West Africa, and Monrovia particularly. Photographers will stand there and they'll rig up a backdrop in the street and you pay them to take the photograph. And I know what you're getting at with contacts and how you get into the guts of a story and what first leads you into it, but I think in both of our experience, quite a lot of it is just being there. That's often key, and here we are. Tim was just there, standing on a street corner for a very long period of time, photographing people who come past, and the results of that project are, there's no way that you could have legislated for what would have happened. It was becoming part of the furniture of the street that led to the taking of these images. So, are there any other questions? Lady at the back.
Hi, I have two questions. One relates to Liberia. This is me. I know Tim from Lagos, basically, to do with Liberia. And just, obviously, Tim has been living out there for quite a few years and has been through the horrific side of it, the war, etc. But I guess for me, Liberia now, there's now a female president who's quite old, a granny, and it's pretty amazing that she actually got to where she got to. I wanted to just ask Tim what he feels about that and what he feels the people in Liberia, their sentiment towards her and their hope for Liberia as well, because we hear what we hear, but being on the ground, what is your actual view of that? That's the first question. And the second one is to do with Nigeria, where I'm from. The Delta story is just so done. I've met so many journalists who've been out to the Delta, and I just don't know the value. I don't know what someone else came out to Delta to do another story. I want to know what value Tim thinks he can bring to telling another Delta story, because to me the Delta is about Western companies, oil, local play, money. It's not complicated. It is very complicated, but the bottom line is it's about money, it's about oil, and it's just. And we living in Nigeria, the Delta there's so many other important issues, I think, and I think it's just been overdone. I want to know what Tim thinks he can really bring to going to Delta and sort of finding out more. I've met so many journalists who are writing books of the Delta and Nigeria, and frankly, we're quite sick of it. So what do you think you can bring to that sort of topic?
To the first question about how do I feel or how do people perceive Ellen, I think it depends how you feel when you get out of bed in the morning. She is very impressive as a person, and I think that there was no doubt in everybody's mind after the election that she should be the ruler of Liberia. I think the international community swung their weight behind her before the election had started and had goaded it and her into her office, although she won the election. There was a big question mark held by certain Liberians over the electoral process, although it was deemed by international monitors to be free and fair. George Weah, the soccer star who was running against her in the runoff, cried foul, and there were riots going on in Monrovia. Ellen has the capability. I don't know of any other Liberian that really has the capabilities to run the country as she does. Though to the rose-tinted glasses, always in Africa, it's always like
isn't it absolutely, it's either so optimistically great or it's so desperately tragic and hopeless. There's no middle ground by which the international community manages to view Africa, and that's part of the problem. And Ellen, one mustn't forget, was a supporter of the MPFL, Taylor. She admits now, where she used to deny that she fundraised for them, she used to fundraise for them. There is suggestion that she crossed from Ivory Coast during the war to inspect the troops in the early 90s. She is a canny political operator, and she, probably like all political operators, has a number of things that she doesn't want to give away in her closet. And her the cabinet shuffle happening at the moment and etc. shows you that there are certain people that she guards close to her. I mean, her son is the head of the NSA. Her half-brother is the head of the Ministry of the Interior. The lady that ran the National Electoral Commission that saw her win became the Justice Minister. But then again, from such a small pool of people, how do you find credible, intelligent, experienced people to run a country? So with that in mind, I kind of view her, I think that she is doing the best job she can, and if somebody wanted to throw Liberia into disarray, they would kill her. But Liberians are also, like everybody, we are opportunistic. People are opportunistic at best. Survival is the most important thing. And recently, the legislative, the senators realized, whilst there was a beginning of her campaign, beginning of her time as presidency, there were very much, there was an opposition to her, led by the Speaker, Edwin Snow, who was married to Taylor's, Edwin Snow was married to one of Taylor's daughters. And, but now that the finger is in the air, testing which way the wind is blowing, they realize that only Ellen has the requisite ability to get Liberia, highly indebted poor country status, to get the international, debt lifted, to get investment, and so they're suddenly going behind her. I mean, again, the journalism focuses on things like diamonds. Let's not forget, diamonds are not going to solve Liberia's problems. I mean, that's just a side issue. They funded the war, sure, but they're not going to get Liberia out of the quagmire. So that's Ellen. Does that answer your question a little? Yeah. As for Nigeria, no, your point is very valid, and especially that since the MEND formed, there have been there has been increased media interest in Nigeria, which is commensurate with the fact that is the elections, it's the American oil the new American shift to get 25% of its oil from the Gulf of Guinea, But for me, I was thinking more about I'm interested in the Delta from a historical perspective of colonialism. It just occurred to me that when we were down there in February, which was at the very beginning, I was one of the first journalists to go down there, so it's not as if we were treading in the footsteps of people to go down. I mean, there's a very small group of us who as you know, Georgia Sodi and, a few people working down there who really who've worked down there as a long term. But it occurred to me when Obasanjo was sending the helicopters to strafe Okra and Cocoa and the villages down there, that what had fundamentally changed since the British were sending gunboats down there to bomb the villages, to get the local chieftains to comply to comply to the rule of commerce. And it seems to me that very little has changed, that the modern Nigerian state, that was still the impulse. And I'm not from West Africa. I'm a white person, but I have a history in West Africa. I mean, I'm from a nation that colonized a lot of West Africa, and we have. It's important, I think, that whilst on the radio this morning the slave reparations is led, Afro-Americans and Africans living outside of Africa are discussing these issues. I think it's important that on this that we as whites in Britain don't just stand dumb and feel like this is also, we have no part to play. That I think that an analysis of history, of colonial history, of trying to make sense of where colonial history has led present-day Nigeria, I think is an important contribution to make. And that is something that, I think that I'd like to do. And that's kind of where I'm thinking about taking the Nigeria project. Yeah. Sorry, Tola.
I think that's a very good point, definitely. But I don't know if the Delta, I understand what you're saying, but I don't know if that's a great starting point in terms of studying the history. I do think that sometimes journalists can get so absorbed with the story that they miss out on so many other things important in the country, actually.
Yeah, but absolutely. But then there are other, there's the implication. I mean, as a journalist, as a visual journalist, I think the Delta is a very strong visual story, and and ultimately it is an aesthetic medium. If I wanted to write a book on Nigeria, then maybe there would be other starting points to make. But I think that there are certain visual connections that are strong in the Delta, and I also think that ultimately, that I'm also prey to supporting the projects, and that if I was to do a project that started somewhere in the north, in Zamfara, or I don't know, could I get that sold and funded? It's, whereas, yes.
Well, I mean, yeah, I understand what you're saying. There's also the view of who's going to want to know. I mean, the Delta is a hot topic at the moment, so it's easier, I guess, in a way to start from there. Well, no, it'll be interesting to see what you come up with anyway, so we'll wait and see.
I'm Leo Bryant from Morris Stopes International. One of your points was pointing out the naivety of the NGO approach of, I think, throwing money at it was your term. And I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate on how you think the international community might be doing something more constructive in Liberia and West Africa.
I think that the international community needs to be in Liberia for a much longer term than it is. At the moment, the paradigm, it appears to be the paradigm that we operate under in terms of international community's responses to places like Liberia is to go in there, UN missions of 5 years, pour a lot of money into it, and then pull out. And of course, then there is a lot of difficulty, and I'm not naive enough to think that there isn't difficulty with keeping international community engagement in Liberia for more than 5 years, to get the Security Council to vote, to get member states to contribute, monitors and to keep. But I think that less money over a longer period of time is a better way to operate. I think that the UN needs to be in these places for a longer period of time. I think that especially West Africa is in such a fragile state. I think that if you look at Sierra Leone and what happened under Kaba, he was handed the SLPP, the Sierra Leone Patriotic Party, was handed the election on the plate because Kaba had stuck by the nation whilst it was being killed by the RUF, although from Guinea, but he squandered the peace process, and then the UN leaves. It's also the UN spends a huge amount of money in its present formation, and maybe there's other ways that it could be acting. Maybe the AU should be supported more. I mean, the AU is an extremely fragile and important place right now, and if the international community could support the AU, it's also suitable for the international community because it means that you wouldn't have foreign peacekeepers necessarily in Liberia. And anyway, at the end of the day, the Nigerians are the hard shock troops, not the Scandinavians or the Irish, although they drive around in fancy tanks and pretend that they're more sophisticated troops. So I think that, and I think that also an international community that actually takes closer consideration of African policy making and African respect for African politicians, a respect for and a support for African political processes. I think that the Taylor trial itself shows how inadequate our view and responses are to the needs of West Africa. I mean, I remember going to see Francis Poku, the Minister of Security in Ghana. Ghana was very sensitive to the fact that Charles Taylor, David Crane, the ex-special prosecutor for the Sierra Leone Special Court, that is trying Taylor and a number of other people, although they're all dying off pretty quickly before they get to trial. David Crane unsealed the indictment indicting Taylor of war crimes in Sierra Leone during the Accra peace talks, when the government of Liberia under Taylor and the rebels were sitting down in Accra trying to work out an agreement. And Crane decided that it was an opportune moment, because Taylor was out of Liberia, therefore out of safety, to unseal an indictment and demand Ghana to hand him over to the special court. And this was an African political peace process going on, and he just walked all over it. And it's an American-backed court, and they walked all over it. And the Africans will never forgive Crane for that, and what may see is they have no sympathy for the special court. Again, Obasanjo, who finished the war in Liberia? It wasn't the UN, it was the Nigerians and the AU. They were the first people to put troops on the ground. And, Obasanjo offered Taylor exile in Nigeria. And what happens is that, Ellen eventually is pressured by the Americans, or so it appears, to ask, because a sitting head of state was one condition that Taylor could be handed out of exile, the Nigerians said, was if a sitting head of state in Liberia asked for his extradition. So Ellen gets into power, and then, somebody nobbled her, perhaps in Washington, perhaps in Europe somewhere, and said, words to the effect, or so we're led to believe, that, if you want aid, you better ask for Taylor's extradition, because we need this court system, this system that, and we need the court, the special court to work. We need Taylor. And the irony is that Taylor's sitting in The Hague, in the holding cells built by the ICC, and he's being tried under Sierra Leone jurisdiction. Do you understand? Taylor isn't being tried by the ICC. He's being tried by the Sierra Leone Special Court, which has been set up to prove that alternative forms of justice can exist outside of the ICC, perhaps because certain member states that don't want to sign the ICC are afraid that their troops may be prosecuted for war crimes. So, and the irony is then he's deemed too dangerous to hold in Sierra Leone. So then he gets transferred to the holding cells of the ICC, where ICC courtrooms will be used. So it's an incredible, cynical policy that the West and the international community has towards West Africa. So I think that, and we try to absolve ourselves by funding money into NGOs that, then the politicians are like, okay, you go and sort the mess out. Here's money to USAID. Here's EU funding. Go and make some basket weaving projects. But the fundamental core of solving these problems is political, and it's a political will to address it in the long term in sensitive ways that take Africans seriously. Is that?
Hi, my name is Gareth Ranimitz. I work in international development for a company called Crown Agents. Just to pick up on the point about power and politics, which I think is really interesting to hear someone talk about sort of core causes of these things. I wonder if you could just explore a bit more what you mean. I mean, is power just about who are the people with the guns, or is there more to it than that?
I mean, there's always more to it than that. And it's a complex, of course it's a complex territory. It's interesting enough with the mortaring picture, and James will know this, there was huge controversy when the mortaring was going on, because you had, in fact, what turned out to be American mortar shells hitting their embassy. The LERD had received mortar shells, Guinean training mortar shells that supplied to Guinea by America for training, apparently for training purposes, that then the LERD then took and used against the 1,000 civilians died around 1,000 people died of LERD mortars, and about 12 dropped on the U.S. embassy. And you had, American officials in Guinea sort of, trying to, and we remember this, trying to get in contact with us as well and saying, tell those guys to stop, you know what I mean? It's, and I think so tracing it back to the guys with the guns, then you can go back further like that. And there are rumors, there are suggestions that we know that the Americans did train Ranger Battalion in 750 Rangers in Guinea to protect the borders from Taylor. They were deployed then to the border regions in 2000 when Taylor started to attack Guinea, Gekadu, to bring the bitter fruit of war to the neighboring countries that had been against him. And there's always that continual suggestion that some Americans, that there was American involvement in training the LERD. Taylor will say it himself. His trial will be an incredible show trial, because I think he is going to take to the stand. So yes, those dynamics of power, that you can trace them in both backwards in that way, from individual actors with a mortar all the way to governments, and sideways as well in terms of tribal family relationships. Who's calling the shots. It's interesting that a lot of weapons, the disarmament figures. We did a study on disarmament the DDR process, which was it was a major success, heralded by the UN as being a major success. And I think the return rate for the LERD we worked out was 32% of weapons were handed in. And Jack Klein, the very flamboyant special representative for the Secretary General in Liberia, who subsequently left after his, he toyed with, he had a relationship, friendly or not friendly, I'm not so sure how friendly he was with a known weapon, an associate of Taylor's daughter. So he left. Sorry, I lost my flow there. Anyway, yeah, the DDR process. So he said, I've disarmed, I've 100,000 combatants. And we remember there's only like 1,000. I remember attacking...
Yeah, the whole weapons decommissioning fiasco was a case in point of misunderstanding power perfectly. I mean, we know that on the final assault on Monrovia, there can't have been more than 800 LERD troops involved.
So they come out with a figure of like 100,000 ex-combatants. And the weapons, if you've got a return rate of 32%, where did they all go? And we're trying to work out where they went. And there is my guess is that they went back to Guinea. And they went back because they were using the power structures of tribal power structures, where commanders, villages on the borders with Guinea to get the weapons back. So the power structure also goes that way as well. Does that answer?
I guess maybe I was trying to lead you down a different track. I spent the last few weeks looking at this sort of the kind of conflict thing myself, and I was told an interesting story in Sri Lanka. Somebody who argued that the ceasefire there about 5 years ago wasn't caused because people had sort of shot at each other too much, but because when they blew up a lot of planes at the airport, the Lloyds and the big insurance companies raised the premiums in Sri Lanka. And this started to screw all the businesses in Colombo, and the private sector suddenly started to put huge amounts of pressure on the politicians, saying, you're putting us out of business, and that was what forced them into the ceasefire. And that's an example of power coming not from who has guns, but then who has money. And I wondered what other the sources of power you see, or whether West Africa doesn't have...
Who has land? The big issue now in the tinderbox for Liberia or for West Africa, I think, is the question of land. It's like the Mandingo tribe who cross all those different frontiers in that area. The Liberians will say Mandingos are not Liberians. You can't come here 50 years ago and then claim to be a Liberian. And that the Mandingo tribe, there was riots and killings going on as displaced populations come back to reclaim their houses. And the Mandingos are clashing with Nimbayans, Guios and Manos from the north of Liberia, over land. They're trying to get chieftaincies in Lofa, up on the borders of the Guinea, recognized as political sub-regions of Lofa County. So, land is a massive issue. And again, it's where, who was, in terms of NGO activity, let's say, it's like, who is supporting, reconciliation processes in the north? If in '98, after the civil war has ended, when the international community focus turned away, Jimmy Carter deemed the elections for Taylor as free and fair, and he was there to see it through, and then everything goes quiet. And in '98, the year after Taylor's in power, Loma and Mandingo are actually killing each other. Where is the international community focus? And I said, so yeah, definitely land is a big issue.
Yeah, we're coming up for 9:30 now, so we'll have the last question.
Hi, Sarah Mallion from Christian Aid. You were speaking earlier about being more interested in themes coming out of your photography rather than captions and the details around the process of making the images. And I was just wondering, this might be a trade secret you don't want to reveal yet, but in terms of your book that's coming, would you therefore not be captioning images, or would the information related to those images be much more less literal, if you like?
I mean, I didn't say that. James sort of said that, but for sure, there will be a lot of text in it. There will be a certain amount of text. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank
very
you
much indeed.